Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with another jam-packed week of World War III analysis. I want to make sure that we get everything packed into 90 minutes or under as we try to do here on the show, because there is so much going on, as of course the Trump transition is well underway as we anticipate the January 2025 inauguration where everything will get shifted. We are going to talk about a lot of these new appointments, these rumored appointments that Trump is floating out there for the Senate to eventually vote on. We are going to talk about the escalations in the Levant, as there are rumors that Israel destroyed an active nuclear weapons research facility in Iran in their recent strike that we are still awaiting on Iran's retaliation for. We're going to be discussing Israel's apparent escalations on the ground in Lebanon as that ground escalation enters its second phase, as Israel sends in more brigades and battalions and whatnot. We're going to be talking about their strikes on Syria. We're going to be talking about Trump calling Netanyahu, Putin, Zelensky, supposedly, all of these rumors about who's talking to who, Putin talking to Olaf Scholz, and big advances on the front lines in Russia. We're going to be discussing where we think peace deals will go, what we think the map is going to look like, all of this good stuff. We have big things to discuss again on the U.S. home front besides just Trump's cabinet positions. New Senate Majority Leader John Thune not looking good on that front. A few other developments, obviously UNIFIL issues going on in Lebanon, issues in Africa with Somalia. We know that it was a failed state, but regions are starting to have their own elections and disavow any connection with Mogadishu. All sorts of things going on across all fronts of World War III. Turkey cutting ties with Israel. Major developments all across the board. Again, we want to make sure that you check out the recent Ether Hour episode. I am not in it, but Dmitry is in it with a good friend of the show, Gennady, who discusses the recent news with BRICS, pretty much everything you would ever want to know about BRICS and the developments towards multipolarity, 2.5+ hours. And there's even graphs and graphics later on in the video. So be sure to check that out. It's on the Substack. It's on the YouTube. It's everywhere. It's the most recent Ether Hour, and it's free for everybody. So all of you supporters, thank you for making that possible. We wanted to make that reference free for everybody to understand the whole multipolarity economic situation better. So thank you for that interview, Dmitry. It was some very good content. But with all of that, let's dive right into this World War III analysis. Be sure to like the video here on Substack or on YouTube, wherever you are listening. I guess on Substack, it's not a video, but you know what I'm saying. The likes and the shares really help us out. They keep the show going. And of course, subscribe and get behind that paywall if you want to really help us out and fund the operation here. So with all of that, Dmitry, what are you thinking about this right now? I want to maybe start with this story about the nuclear weapons research facility in Iran, as well as the other Levantine issues. What do you think is going on with that? And is this the fulfillment of the prophecy we talk so much about on the show? Is this, an early stage of that? What's going on here?
Yeah, very interesting story, actually. And it's really unconfirmed by any Iranian media. Essentially, it's primarily Western as well as pro-Israeli sources which are releasing the story. But if there's any sort of element of truth to the story itself, Conrad, is that, well, the impact of this particular Israeli strike against an alleged Iranian nuclear facility, a secret facility in the mountains of Parchin, an area located in Iran, which Israel carried out a few weeks ago, right? And for which Iran has still not retaliated. So Israel essentially is claiming that its airstrikes were aimed specifically at an Iranian nuclear facility, which has been severely damaged or even destroyed. Now, this particular complex, there's some satellite footage which does show some sort of complex structures in the mountains. Allegedly, apparently most of them were underground, so subterranean. Perhaps certain tests were being conducted. Israel, at least the Israeli media, Israeli Times, the Times of Israel, Axios as well, which is quite a liberal, pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist publication, MSM, they are reporting that these particular facilities were essentially not just looking into nuclear energy or nuclear reactors or anything of this sort, working with Rosatom, but in particular, they were looking at the development of nuclear weaponry, which Iran has boasted about for quite some time in terms of it always has stated over the last decade or so, Conrad, that it had the capacity to develop these nuclear technologies, which could wipe Israel off the face of the earth in one or two, maybe missile strikes, which again, you could stick a nuclear warhead onto one of these hypersonic ballistic missiles, which fly over to Israel in no time whatsoever, and which apparently Israel cannot defend itself from these particular strikes. So this story, I think there are still no official claims from any, say, pro-BRICS, pro-Iranian media sources, but the story does give us some perspective into potentially why Iran is still, it's been a few weeks since this very demoralizing strike against Iranian cities and certain military bases in Iran by Israel, and still Iran has not retaliated. So the real question arises, perhaps Israel did strike a very key target somewhere in the Parchin Mountains. Some of those subterranean facilities were in fact destroyed, And just like a sort of top secret Area 51 location in Iran, the Persian elites, the Persian government is simply not interested in actually engaging with Israel, knowing that Israel, through one way or another, perhaps through its Mossad, perhaps through CIA agents, or deep infiltration of the so-called Jewish communities within Iran who have lived in Iran for a very long time now, thousands of years at this point, have infiltrated through intelligence agencies and such the Iranian elites to the point where they know exactly where these secret facilities are located, and they were not afraid to hit them. And this has demoralized Iran to the point where the Iranian officials are not willing to, again, reignite further engagement, retaliate against Israel in any open capacity. And in fact, now they're looking back and reassessing how well is the Iranian counterintelligence operating in order to stop Mossad, in order to stop these infiltrations, and what exactly does Israel know about some of these secret facilities within Iran? We're under no illusions, Conrad, that Iran does have its own weapons development complexes, its own interests, but if Israel does have knowledge of them, and if Israel did potentially strike right at the heart of this particular project, this could be only, the first step towards, if there is any further escalation, Israel and the US in a collaboration together, knowing where these bases are, could strike and essentially destroy decades worth of work that Iran has invested itself into, probably since the 1990s or even 1980s. And this is probably one of the reasons, I'd say, hypothetically, as to why Iran still hasn't struck back against Israel. And this is all, of course, taking place in the wake of Trump's new appointments, this very strong anti-Iranian rhetoric, which we see from the United States. Israel, again, is not bending the knee, is not calling for any sort of long-term peace against Iran, has still deemed Iran as its main enemy. And we do see a very strong anti-Iranian rhetoric, at least dominating most Western media sources. In fact, Iran is being blamed for essentially all of worldly anti-Semitism, for supporting Hamas, for supporting Hezbollah. And as we mentioned last week, I think the real pressure is on this Iranian proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon at the moment and in northern Israel, against which Israel is mobilizing almost its entire IDF force now that Hamas has been severely weakened in Gaza, and now that there's a potential operation taking place in the West Bank as well. The West Bank, by the way, being a lot less militarized than the Gaza Strip and a lot less, shall we say, radicalized against Israel. But nevertheless, Israel, again, it doesn't really care how weak its hypothetical opponents are. I think they're willing to look out for their own interests. I think this is the overarching story generally, is that Israel is like essentially a predator on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. In the west of the Middle East, it literally looks out for itself first and foremost. It literally buys US politicians. It buys influence across the world. It buys influence in Russia, in Europe, and it pursues its personal goals regardless of what anybody else thinks. And Iran, it doesn't appear that Iran is interested in putting its interests first, and perhaps even defending its interest in Syria, its interest in Lebanon. And potentially this is because Israel does have its finger on the pulse, in particular the pulse of uranium, the pulse of nuclear technology, and it's threatened Iran, maybe through some covert channels that, look, if you dare strike against Israel once again, we will hit you where it hurts. And in fact, the results of the next strikes will become public knowledge, not these sort of secret stories which we're receiving, Conrad, from mostly Israeli sources that, well, these facilities were destroyed. Perhaps the next strikes against Iran will be made a lot more public. And I'm not pro-Israeli by any stretch, but we do need to keep in mind that the Israeli military, its air force, is very well developed. They are incredibly capable. I think out of most countries in the Middle East, the Israeli Air Force is one of the most powerful, most experienced air forces. And we really shouldn't underestimate exactly what kind of damage they dealt against Iran all those weeks ago. And we do have to question why Iran still hasn't retaliated. And I'm not saying Iran is cowardly. Perhaps this is an incredibly calculated move from the Iranian elites, especially after the mysterious death of their president, the various assassinations literally inside of the Iranian capital, and Israel's continued pressure against Hezbollah. It's sort of unflinching and staunchly aggressive moves against its opponents. Perhaps Iran doesn't want to be on the other side of this broadsword, which is coming to cut the head off any of the enemies of Zion here in the Middle East.
Well, I remember I was blackpilling pretty hard, the day before the Iranian strike on the Nevatim air base and their, ballistic missile barrage on October 1st. So I'm going to hold back any, skepticism on what they seem to claim that there will be a retaliation. We're going to see what that is. And I was actually surprised that they were hyping up a retaliation after what I perceive to be a fairly weak Israeli response. But if this story is true and it was a strike on a facility that was developing research that was directly going to be used to implement nuclear weapons and, the weaponization of whatever nuclear material that they do have developed right now, then that brings a lot of perspective to why they might be taking this response so seriously. So we're watching this very closely. We know that, as the prophecies say, it's going to be a bit of a surprise, and we're going to be drinking our coffee and suddenly this is going to happen. So again, this might be a bit of a precursor and a bit of a, like you said, an Israeli or Western media attempt to kind of scare the Iranians into realizing how infiltrated they may or may not be on the intelligence front regarding the location of these places. So we're keeping an eye on all of that. But you mentioned Lebanon, you mentioned Hezbollah, obviously the main arm of Iran that is currently fighting Israel directly. And this is from LNU on Telegram. They say there's now official Israeli confirmation that they expanded the ground operation under the command of the 36th and 91st Divisions. Some brigades now will stay in defensive lines in the first border villages in Lebanon, while others will start advancing and raiding towards the second line. There is no report yet in Lebanon to indicate where, and no information yet of any clashes, but Ainatha and Bet Jabel are on the list. This is from 2 days ago. And then after a few more reports have occurred, we are seeing now some of these clashes in some of these towns, the outskirts of Bet Jabel and these other places, and both sides are exchanging huge airstrikes. And Israeli soldiers, despite the fact that they're clearing some of these huge areas of countryside outside of these cities, somehow they are missing some of the tunnel entrances. They aren't catching all of the missile salvos, and they will have quote unquote cleared an area. Then they'll look back and they'll see right from a location they claim to have just been at a bunch of missiles getting launched towards Haifa or launched towards Tel Aviv. And they're like, what the heck? Like, we just cleared that area. So clearly the asymmetrical guerrilla warfare, this, entrenched tunnel dug in, network warfare is going on, and it is not as easy as anybody anticipated. And last week we were reporting that obviously there were a lot of withdrawals and apparent, slowdowns of certain ground operations. And some were saying that there were peace negotiations on the way, but very recently, ever since especially Yoav Gallant was dismissed and Israel Katz was put in, and he was the Israeli ambassador to the United States, he was replaced in that role by the ultranationalist, I'm forgetting his name, who Netanyahu initially wanted to put as Minister of Defense, but he compromised and got someone that was slightly less offensive as an ultranationalist, but he is trying to implement actually the deployment of the Haredi Jews who are, I think, resisting some kind of deployment, which I believe Netanyahu doesn't even agree with. So maybe that was the compromise. But again, there have been a lot of escalations as far as the situation there, including Smotrich and other parties openly talking about annexation of the West Bank, trying to get Trump to greenlight annexation of the West Bank, openly saying 2025 is when we will do that. And I don't want to tease too much. We're going to explicitly talk about it probably just in a few minutes in more detail. But Mike Huckabee, Trump's tap for ambassador to Israel, he is already talking about how, settlements and this stuff in the West Bank are dirty words. And these are just, these are citizens of Israel moving to a part of their country. So he is in full favor of West Bank annexation for Israel. So that is something that we are very much going to be on the watch for as Trump continues to stack his cabinet with ultra-Zionists. But other news going on in Lebanon, of course, this is from a local Arabic reporter. He says, according to available information, a force from UNIFIL, specifically the group called the Force Commanders Reserve, which reports directly to UNIFIL Chief of Staff, traditionally occupied by a French officer, they raided a weapons and ammunition depot belonging to the resistance on Thursday in the town of Kalawieh in the central sector of southern Lebanon. UNIFIL claimed that it informed the army, meaning the Lebanese army, and obtained its approval, but my information indicates otherwise, and that the army refused to allow the international force to take any step. After the army withdrew from the area south of the Litani River, UNIFIL began to act contrary to the text, such that it was not bound by the necessity of its presence of supporting a patrol from the army, but rather carried out its activities with complete independence, which constitutes a blatant violation of the text, and he cites the UNIFIL charter. So clearly there's, some forces within the UN, which, again, they're always accused of Israel of being totally biased towards the Arabs or towards the Muslims or towards the Christians in the region when they are being totally neutral. But then, of course, I'm sure they're going to be praised in the media for directly interfering here and clearly, going against Hezbollah in this situation, which, again, we know that all of the Christian parties, we discussed this last week more and more, they've been the only ones, first of all, to congratulate Trump, the Lebanese Christian parties, which have been signaling strongly against Hezbollah. And, if this UNIFIL group is led by a French chief of staff, France, obviously they haven't been they've been drifting away from Israel in the midst of all of this as well. But it seems that perhaps Macron and the French are trying to work with the Christian parties in Lebanon to come to a sort of compromise position. And maybe UNIFIL is now going to feel emboldened to operate against Hezbollah. So interesting developments there. But I know the other thing going on regarding Hezbollah is its supply from Iran through Syria. And we know that people have put in all sorts of requests to Russia to interfere with this. And we know that, Russia is obviously aware of these supply lines. Dimitri, I don't know if you have any thoughts or opinions on that. I know also Erdogan and Turkey, they have totally severed all diplomatic ties with Israel. So that is an interesting development there, if you have any comments on those two fronts.
Yeah, if you recall, dear listeners, around early October, there was a strike by, essentially a sortie of Israeli warplanes that flew over the Mediterranean, went and attacked an arms depot, allegedly storing munitions given from Iran to Syria. And this depot in the port of Latakia in Syria was located next to the Khmeimim Syrian base, which is at the moment essentially leased and essentially given to Russian Air Force and other Russian forces essentially for free over the last 10 years or so. So the Russians are located at the Khmeimim Air Base, and the arms depot was hit. And there was, of course, recent commentary from the Russian presidential special envoy to Syria named Alexander Lavrentiev. He's essentially this head of the Russian, I suppose, civil forces and all those personnel who are not directly involved in the military in Syria. He's in charge of essentially assisting the Assad regime in rebuilding Syria and rebuilding some of their key cities after this destructive civil war, which still, frankly, hasn't ended because, as we can see, Syria is being bombed very directly by Israel as well as whomever else is located in its east, including, of course, the Americans as well as Kurds, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc., all these degenerative sort of anti-Syrian forces. But Lavrentiev stated very openly, he said, we consistently warn that Israeli military should have very serious consequences if they strike against Syria. President Putin confirmed in a previous press conference that an Israeli strike hit a warehouse near our airbase in Khmeimim, approximately 1.5 kilometers away from the base itself. He said, if Russian forces have harmed you, it will lead to negative consequences. So he's stating that Russia has S-400 missile systems located at Khmeimim Air Base, but they haven't struck against Israel. But the hypothetical is still there, Conrad, that if Israel flies its planes too close to the Russian airbase, the Russians will shoot at them. And most likely these are not F-35 stealth fighters. There's hypothetical as well that, the S-400 missile defense systems can shoot down stealth fighters as well. So they have that technology to sort of bypass any of their stealth technology, shielding, etc. So Lavrentiev has spoken out very openly against sort of Israeli aggression. He's also stated that Russia and Israel should cooperate diplomatically in order to resolve any of these sort of conflicts in Syria. And these are just words, because we know Israel at this point has bombed Syria more than 230 times over the last year since the 7th of October. These bombings have been incredibly direct. They've killed Syrian personnel. They've destroyed, probably millions of dollars of Syrian equipment, military equipment, which belongs, frankly, not to Iran, not to Hezbollah, but literally the Syrian people who are trying to retake their own country and sort of reestablish their sovereignty. So we have to keep that in mind. Israel is essentially weakening Syria's response to ISIS, against which Syria has been fighting for all these years, which again leads us to question as to who exactly is behind ISIS, who does ISIS cooperate with. So Lavrentiev openly stated another very interesting fact, right, regarding the funding of Hezbollah and sort of the passing of arms to Hezbollah through Syria. He stated that the Russian bases are actually, and in particular the Khmeimim Air Base, does not have any arms depots in the Russian base itself of any equipment and any arms which end up going to Hezbollah officially. So he stated openly that Russia has never supplied Hezbollah with any military equipment whatsoever, and that these particular Russian air bases are essentially not targets which Israel should be looking at. Now, some of us may kind of look at this, Conrad, and say, well, on one hand, he's trying to be diplomatic. On the other side, I think he's openly saying that Russian interests, they don't exactly align with the interests of President Assad, who's essentially borderline declared war against Israel for its bombardment of its own people. Russia essentially is trying to look out for its own interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, some of which are, well, to keep lukewarm or perhaps friendly relationships with Israel. We see almost a conflict of interest there between Russia and Israel, between Russia and Syria. It's almost as if Russia's trying to play both sides. We've criticized the Russian military establishment for this in the past, given the fact that Lebanon, to speak very frankly, is being bombed with a similar intensity to Gaza at the moment. We had strikes of Israeli Air Force in northern Beirut. We've had strikes. There were 5 apartment buildings which were destroyed in southern Beirut through direct airstrikes. Now, we know that Israel, whenever it strikes these civilian apartment buildings, it claims that these apartment buildings have some sort of Hezbollah affiliation or Hamas affiliation, whatever, right? Their excuses are quite broad. They've used them against the Palestinian people before in sort of commenting on the genocide. But it does show you very, very clearly that the position of Moscow is not always in an anti-Zionist stance, it's somewhat wavering there. So they're almost walking the blade of the knife, trying not to go in either direction, not to sort of fall off. They're doing a very interesting balancing act here. And the other thing is a top Netanyahu confidant has visited Russia actually last week. I think it was the 11th or 12th of November. And he actually spoke to Vladimir Putin personally. He's discussed certain plans of Russia in Syria and exactly how Russia and Israel can cooperate in order to not engage in conflict with one another. And again, it really doesn't make much sense. I think most of our listeners will be still very confused as to why Russia allows its ally to be bombed. But until we have any direct reports from Russia condemning these strikes, we really just have to take a very critical position to the Russian Federation's military bases located in Syria, because allegedly, if you're trying to protect your ally, first and foremost, you should protect your ally from being bombarded by their neighboring country, right, Israel. So just keeping that in perspective, it's not all sort of roses. It's not, Russia and Syria is not doing the best at the moment. In fact, I think it may be even straining Russian relations with Assad. And I'm sure certain Syrian politicians are incredibly frustrated at the fact that Syrian targets are being hit kind of indiscriminately, and there's almost no responses. Russia's not willing to defend Syrian airspace in any capacity. Sure, it's willing to fight ISIS on the ground, and it's willing to fly Russian planes into the east of Syria to bomb all these degenerate Islamist, Wahhabi, Salafi groups, but it's not willing to defend Syria against the Zionists. So I think that's very key. We spoke about this with Syrian Girl very openly. These are real contradictions taking place in real time in the Middle East. And I think, well, I'm not sure how exactly it'll be resolved, except for the fact that Turkey may be this linchpin country which kind of turns all of this into an even deeper confusing position, because, again, Erdogan has met up with Assad and all the other economic leaders of Islamic countries in Saudi Arabia this week, Conrad. And there was a very key moment where when all the presidents of the various Islamic countries were giving their speeches, as soon as Assad began speaking, President Erdogan of Turkey left the table and kind of left Assad hanging. One of Assad's points was that, well, there is this Turkish occupation of northern Syria kind of ongoing at the moment. The Turks are having their own special military operation against the Kurds and even against some official Syrian personnel up there in the north. And so Assad was quite critical of that, and Erdogan was not having any of it. And we know Erdogan and Turkey, we've spoken about their influence over the entire region. As you mentioned before we started recording, the fact that Turkey still exists and is sort of in the middle of the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern compass, it's literally the linchpin country that isn't a superpower. Everything relies on Turkey in some way. Turkish relations with NATO, with Greece, Cyprus, they're all very deeply tied into the geopolitical mosaic, which will eventually, I think, unfold into the hot Third World War, which at the moment does not even seem avoidable in any capacity. And just reminiscing about the end of October, we do recall when Turkish friendly relations with Pakistan essentially had India boycott their membership into BRICS, which I think was one of the biggest moves in recent history. It didn't seem like a major story, but I think this will be one of those really impactful diplomatic positions which will backfire in the future, especially if we're speaking about world peace and how the world can kind of hold itself back from going into a war. It's almost like a pre-World War I scenario where Turkey is simply not allowed to engage with sort of constructive nations, especially nations of the BRICS, in a relatively peaceful fashion. And in fact, Turkey is always standing on its toes. So with this in mind, Conrad, I was just wondering your thoughts exactly on how Turkish sort of diplomatic break with Israel, how exactly that can influence the region as well. Because again, Turkey is not exactly friendly with Assad. Now it seems Turkey is not very friendly with Israel either. But notice the break in diplomacy and the breach of diplomatic relations really doesn't mean anything, because we do know Turkey's closest ally, Azerbaijan, is still sending gas and oil and even military equipment in small sort of deposits and exports to Israel officially. And Turkey itself is also exporting material and goods to Israel as well actively.
Yeah, it's a good question because, again, Erdogan is saying this stuff. We got to obviously check the trails and make sure that at a diplomatic level it actually goes through and there is a, formal process that's followed for this, withdrawing of recognition. But I mean, we remember when Erdogan first said that we're severing all trade with Israel, and that just, didn't happen. They just kept secretly trading with Israel. And again, I've always said that Erdogan's death, I think, is going to catch us off guard. And I believe that if he moves too far down the path of going against Israel, perhaps he might find that his death is expedited in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know. I mean that from anything from he might just, God might decide that his time has come and it's time to get this show on the road, or Mossad takes him out, right? You can literally fill in whatever you find most interesting in that category. But I think the place of Turkey is obviously very regionally significant. Obviously, I think we see Saudi Arabia as sort of the most compromised by Israel. Even recent reports have emerged that in interviews when he was younger, MBS was talking about how his mother is just a Jew. So we know that at best, Saudi Arabia is going to be neutral on this. And obviously Iran overtly countering Israel. And Turkey is this kind of the third Islamic superpower that has to be reckoned with, the Arab, Turkish, and Persian worlds. And outside of Erdogan's sort of political Islamist group, which is probably representative of about 40% of people in Turkey, the rest of Turkey isn't exactly about this confrontation with Israel. And we see what's going on in Syria as well as, you mentioned that situation where Erdogan left the room when Assad was speaking. But in the context of this report where Erdogan is talking about severing relations with Israel, he says, as a nation and government, the Turkish Republic, we have decided to cut diplomatic ties with Israel and we currently have no relations with them. He made these remarks, obviously, at the Arab Islamic Summit in Riyadh. He then went on to say, we have extended our hand towards Syria for normalization, and we believe this will open doors to peace and stability in Syrian territories. The unity of Syrian territory is not under threat from Syrians residing in various countries, and Assad must recognize this and take necessary steps to establish a new climate in his nation. Erdogan also noted that Israel's threats to its neighbors, including Syria, are not mere imagination. Addressing the fight against terrorism, Erdogan remarked, there are areas along our borders held by terrorists, and full security cannot be achieved without clearing them and eradicating the roots of terrorism. He concluded, cross-border operations for our country's security remain on our agenda, and we are prepared to initiate them at any time if we feel threatened. And that's very ambiguous, and that could even mean that they view Russian-backed groups and elements of the Syrian Arab army as terroristic because they have struck them before. But if they were only talking about U.S.-backed forces, then why don't they just unite with Assad and the Russians? Obviously, there's something much deeper going on here that isn't being stated overtly. So as much as he says we've extended, our hand towards Syria, Erdogan, as far as we can tell, he isn't 100% behind, disavowing regime change against Assad entirely. He seems to be leaving that on the table, because if not, why wouldn't he be able to, look him in the eyes at this summit? So interesting developments across the board. And I think that's a good transition towards the situation in the Trump cabinet, which is so tied in with what's going on in Israel and the Levant. And we, of course, reported on Susie Wiles being tapped as chief of staff in last week's episode, which is, not worst case scenario, but definitely not best case scenario. And as of now, this is just sort of the official list. Some of these are from Trump himself. Others are, sort of official rumors that have not been disavowed by Trump. So some of these could change. Most of them are legitimate. But again, none of these have been approved by the Senate. Trump isn't even the president yet. So a lot of these are subject to change. But in theory, this is who Trump would have filling these roles as Secretary of State. You have Marco Rubio, neoconservative type senator from Florida. For Attorney General, he claims to have tapped Congressman Matt Gaetz, which is probably one of the better picks. People are more excited about that from an America First perspective, but he's going to have a harder time making it through the Senate. For HHS Secretary, you got RFK Jr., which shocked a lot of people considering that Trump's Jewish transition head, Howard Lutnick, said that explicitly was not going to happen. And now other people are coming out, Mike Pence definitely sincerely, coming out against this because RFK, of course, is pro-choice and, he's in favor of reparations and all this other stuff, which again, I'm sure RFK will just disavow these positions because he was only really hyping those up to win a Democratic primary. But, maybe some legitimate concerns. For UN ambassador, of course, Elise Stefanik, ultra-Zionist congresswoman from New York. So not the best pick there. For border czar, which is a sort of catch-all term for overseeing the border operation, you have Tom Homan, who's one of the better picks. For Secretary of Defense, you have Pete Hegseth, who is a veteran type guy. He's a ultra-Zionist as well, big Christian Zionist type guy that I know some people claim to like him. He's very anti-DEI, of course. He is very anti-woke. So there's a lot of people that like him on that regard. But, as far as confronting Iran, he is very hawkish. So, interesting developments there. For National Security Advisor, we have Michael Waltz, who is a Zionist and a China hawk. So not great there. For Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, Governor of South Dakota, not a great pick there. For Director of National Intelligence, we have Tulsi Gabbard, which is surprising. She is, Zionists and Jews like Barry Weiss will claim she's like an Assad toady in Putin's back pocket, which I don't really know how true that is, but she's definitely not confrontational in those regards. And she's spoken favorably of the UOC and the persecution there. So that's a fairly good development. As I mentioned earlier, Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, ultra-Zionist, Christian Zionist, former governor of Arkansas, father of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was in Trump's previous administration, one of his press secretaries. And he has made some very explicit comments, like I said, supporting West Bank annexation and striking Iran and these other sorts of things. So fairly dangerous developments there. We have some interesting developments with Stephen Chung as his White House communications director. I remember when he was just a low-level Trump guy. So pretty cool developments there. Definitely, compared to 2016, more loyalist types are getting rewarded. Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, which is a great pick. Stephen Miller may be a Zionist Jew, but he definitely does good things on the home front, and he understands the Great Replacement and issues there. Then we, of course, have the Department of Government Efficiency, this Doge meme with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy supposedly implementing, Schedule F, supposedly, and dramatically decreasing federal bureaucracy and, slashing federal employment in some of these administrations and even destroying entire administrations that don't need to exist. So some very interesting developments across the board there. There are a few other developments like Doug Burgum as Secretary of the Interior, but I'm not a huge expert on that much about Doug Burgum, even though he, tried to run for president. So I'll, of course, be looking into more of these people. We will be posting about them on the World War Now X at World War Now _. Be sure to follow us there, and on the World War Now Telegram, World War Now Telly. But Dimitri, what are your thoughts on some of these appointments, and what do you think about some of the news about Zelensky and Putin's developments regarding Trump's picks and, where that could go, as well as, his supposed call to Netanyahu? And it is claimed that he said that on day one of his presidency, any of the restrictions on weapon shipments to Israel are going away. So I want to know your thoughts on the incoming administration and how it is going to affect foreign policy and, the two major fronts of World War III that we are funding right now.
Yeah, Conrad, this selection of very skilled, mostly young politicians under the age of 50, I would say Marco Rubio is perhaps the oldest one here, or perhaps Tom Homan as well. But Tom Homan perhaps is the most based in terms of his position on Israel really doesn't matter. Primarily, it's his domestic view of the illegals, of the mass migrants sort of coming over the Mexican border, which is important. And as long as he's tough on the borders, really his opinion on what takes place in the Middle East or Eastern Europe is kind of irrelevant. But people like Pete Hegseth, I think Marco Rubio, we see people who are essentially somewhat NATO skeptics, right? Getting in Matt Gaetz as well. His support temporarily, at least for January 6th sort of protesters. These are people who essentially are, you can say, not neocon American nationalists, but essentially this new wave of 2016 Trumpist American nationalists who are primarily, yes, these people are pro-Zionist, but in a very American perspective. In fact, Pete Hegseth, him being a Navy SEAL veteran, he's very hardcore guy, looks very patriotic, looks very Christian, but you see some of his speeches where he's speaking out in favor of the third temple being built in Jerusalem. Obviously, he's probably for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, bringing about essentially the reign of the Moshiach very openly, despite the fact that he literally has a cross of Jerusalem on his chest tattooed. He has Deus Vult on his bicep. He has all these Christian tattoos. But I think given that real right-wing Christians, including traditional Catholics, traditional, Orthodox Christians in the US is still quite a fairly sizable minority. I think essentially we need to be somewhat optimistic about some of these picks. Essentially, some of these delusional Schofield Bible Christians who are very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, essentially their opinion of Israel simply hasn't changed because I don't think they've ever heard a sort of non-Zionist critique of Talmudic Judaism or Zionism in general. And I think it's simply about moving the Overton window perhaps a little bit more to the right. And despite the fact that these people are primarily Zionists, we have to understand that there is no alternative for us except for, kind of appreciating what we have. And domestically speaking, some of these young people being put into these key positions in ministerial cabinet positions, my view as an outsider looking into American politics, I can kind of tell potentially by promoting some of the views that, World War Now has been speaking about how some of our allies on X, Twitter, etc., Telegram, pushing the reveal, the expose of Talmudic Judaism and Zionism online may potentially change the minds of some of these people, move them towards a more Thomas Macy-like stance and viewpoint. I think that's very important that some of these people, including Tulsi Gabbard even, who, she, remember at the beginning of the SMO, her position on Russia-Ukraine was very pro-Russian. She even said, well, look, Vladimir Putin and Zelensky should sit at the same table and there should be a aloha peace. Or she made some crazy video remark which triggered Ukrainians and Banderites. It's literally as Russian tanks were rolling through some of these key Ukrainian oblasts, she was speaking about aloha peace, some sort of Hawaiian voodoo sort of thing. And it was just completely bizarre and hilarious. But some of these people are strong Ukraine skeptics, which is a big plus, I think, for Orthodox Christianity in general. Yes, they're very pro-Zionist, but at the same time, their pro-Zionism is very vulgar, very it's almost more Zionist than even some of the, I would say, than some of the secular Jews in the United States. Like I would say even more than like the Jewish Hollywood lobby. It's almost comically, caricaturistically Zionist, Conrad. And I think with that in mind, there's still the opportunity for them to perhaps change their minds, given perhaps in this 4-year term or perhaps in the future. But generally speaking, some of these selections, I think the common theme here is, especially Stefanik being the UN ambassador, it's a pro-Israel administration, very strongly pro-Israel. They won't ever sort of surrender Israel to any of its so-called enemies, any of its neighbors. But at the same time, it's a very NATO skeptic, globalism skeptic administration, and they're very wary of providing more money to some of these Ukrainian oligarchs, including many of which have crawled into the Zelensky administration. And perhaps they're even somewhat Chabad skeptics, like that Chabad Lubavitch lobby sort of occupying Ukraine. Perhaps they're not even aware that the fact that Andrei Yermak and Kolomoisky and some of his people are literally in control of Zelensky's political party from the inside. And maybe they're just viewing Ukraine as like a corrupt country that the US should stop funding. So generally speaking, I think we need to have a somewhat balanced position on this administration without putting on any rose-colored glasses. This is a very strongly Zionist. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if these people in 10, 12 years' time, when, J.D. Vance is president, for example, in the future, will be for the establishment of, say, a third temple in Jerusalem. We really cannot sort of disclaim that these people are exactly that sort of administration. This is peak Shabbos Goyism on one hand, but on the other hand, they are very much, by blood at least, they are American people. Delusional, yes, but at the same time, is there an opportunity for them to change? I think potentially so. We'll be covering all of their sort of positions and developments on this show. I think as the administration moves along, I think going into this very hot conflict that's developing, unfortunately speaking, it does really, the only thing that this administration warns me about, Conrad, is that the United States will be very strongly tied to Israel in the coming Third World War when it enters into its hot phase, especially in the Middle East. I think this says some very bad things about US interests in the Middle East in the long term. And again, the new sort of war and terror, especially after the destabilization of Iran, which is probably coming amidst the Third World War, this will have some long-term consequences on, I would say, just the entire stability of the region. So unfortunately, there are very dire consequences to this very pro-Zionist administration lobby that's currently in power. And just last comment I wanted to make, the US Ambassador Stefanik, it's very key that she's such a strong pro-Israel spokesperson, because the UN is one of those international forums and bodies which, again, we don't have any illusions. We know the UN is a globalist structure set up by the globalists post the Second World War, by communists and by hardcore liberals. There was nothing Christian about it in the first place. But nevertheless, it is a very accessible forum, which is very transparent and open. People speak about very important geopolitical, economic, and geostrategic interests globally in a very open forum. And the fact that she's very pro-Israel and the fact that she will defend and veto any anti-Israeli developments in the UN is, I think, quite negative. I think the US really needed a UN ambassador who would perhaps view the Netanyahu regime or view, say, Israel's hawkish positions on the Palestinians, on Lebanon, and even on Iran through, sort of realpolitik angle, not a sort of, in a way, a religious and almost zealous fashion that Israel is this chosen world, this chosen country that the US needs to defend in the United Nations forever and ever. And unfortunately, I think Stefanik is going to fail that particular position for the Trump's administration in the United Nations. It's going to be somewhat even embarrassing when, say, in 1 or 2 years, when the Israeli conflict dies down and perhaps Netanyahu's in prison and the UN begins proceedings and talks about exactly what to do with these particular people, how to sanction them, how to send them to the Hague, ICC, ICJ proceedings. And again, we'll have somebody like Stefanik speaking out in favor of the very strong, hawkish Israeli lobby in the United Nations. It's just going to be an embarrassment, I think, for all Americans. So I think that's probably the only very bad appointment that we have here. Probably the worst one, I would say.
Yeah, as far as, best to worst, I would say the worst, the Marco Rubio one is not good. However, it could have been worse. Like, there were worse people that could have gone to. The Tulsi Gabbard pick is obviously one of the best. And in fact, her being as UN ambassador instead of Stefanik would have been a more appropriate and better pick as far as, like you said, having the US lean more into the, the actual opinion of pretty much every country at the United Nations, which is that Israel is a genocidal, insane country. But I don't think Tulsi Gabbard's even going to get approved for DNI. So we're just going to see who that actually goes to. I'm similarly skeptical with RFK, with HHS, but the rest of them, I could definitely see them getting approved. I think Hegseth is the biggest wild card. I think we have no idea really what he's going to do, but Most other people are pretty thoroughly Zionist. And of course, we also saw the Senate Republicans vote on the new Senate Majority Leader, as Mitch McConnell is, old and decrepit. And unfortunately, they elected who was possibly the worst of the three options, John Thune from South Dakota. He beat out John Cornyn and Rick Scott of Florida. Rick Scott was obviously the much preferred option from MAGA people. Apparently, John Thune was secret ballots, and he won 29-24 against Cornyn in the final round of voting. So even the Senate Republicans are not united behind this guy. And this guy has never seen an immigrant he didn't want to give citizenship. He's never seen a dollar he didn't want to give to Israel. And as far as stuff that actually matters as social conservative stuff, he really doesn't care. So this guy is Jewed up, zogged up, and we fear it could be another, because remember in 2016, Trump had the Senate in the House as well. And, the Senate was actually more willing to work with him in the House. They were only willing to do certain stuff because Paul Ryan was the leader. We might have a similar situation here with Thune as the Senate leader, and they don't want to actually do mass deportations, build the wall, this, that, or the other, because, again, this guy loves the Great Replacement. So not the best there, but the real issue, I think the real most problematic pick, which we can point to other statements that we talked about in the previous segment about Israel, is Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel. He might be the oldest one. I think he's pushing 70. And these are comments from Bezalel Smotrich, who said that Donald Trump's return to power in the United States is an important opportunity. And then he went on to say that the year 2025 will be, with God's help, the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, the far-right minister said, using the biblical name for the West Bank.
Wow.
Smotrich, whose ministerial portfolio has also included some areas of the defense ministry's work, said that he had ordered preparations for applying sovereignty over Israeli settlements. Speaking at a meeting in Parliament, he said he had instructed the Director of Settlement Affairs in the Defense Ministry and the Civil Administration to prepare the necessary infrastructure for applying sovereignty. Smotrich congratulated U.S. President Donald Trump on his incredible and sweeping victory, which the far-right politician said also brings an important opportunity to the state of Israel. During his first term, President Trump led dramatic moves, Smotrich said. These included recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, breaking with much of the international community by moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and brokering a set of normalization deals between Israel and several Arab countries. Before the normalization agreements dubbed the Abraham Accords, the Israeli government had said it would annex large Israeli settlement blocks in the West Bank before scrapping the plan as the deals were announced. We were on the verge of applying sovereignty over the settlements in Judea and Samaria, Smotrich said. Now it is time to do it. So he then obviously goes on to talk about Israel's new appointed foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, who Netanyahu wanted to appoint as Golan's former position as defense minister. He said that Palestinian statehood was not realistic after Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas reiterated his demand for sovereignty, despite the fact that Hamas and Fatah have now been in discussions. For Hamas has been willing to cede power to the Palestinian Authority. Saudi Arabia, I know, is in support of this. So, Sa'ar and Smotrich may be saying this stuff, but I don't think they can actually boss Abbas around like they think they can, because Abbas has the support of people like Russia, people like the rest of the Islamic world, even the Islamic world that supports Israel. I think the only country that might be willing to not even support Abbas would be the Shabbos Goys in the United Arab Emirates, who should really just be ashamed of themselves at this point. But that is, I think, my main takeaway from these cabinet picks. Mostly a bunch of Zionists. Like I said, Hegseth is, I think, the biggest wild card. I've heard a few people that I, respect say that, he might be more of our guy than we think. But, some of the Christian Zionism stuff is not looking too good on that front. But unless you have anything else to say about what's going on in the Levant, Dimitri, I would love to hear the frontline updates in Russia, because we know that things are getting pretty, expansive as far as the Russian victories across the front line. And we also have to, of course, talk about the future map and the negotiations, because Trump himself said on the campaign trail that he would end the war before he even took office. So clock is ticking. He won the election. It's been a few weeks. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. But first, let's hear what is actually going on along the front lines. Where is the fighting happening? Is it happening everywhere? Because that's what I seem to be seeing on my sources.
Absolutely. No, you're completely right, Conrad. Fighting is taking place literally in 4 or 5 oblasts at the moment at the same time. And this is excluding Kherson. So if we begin on the Zaporozhye front, but before we sort of commence going through the various cities and confrontation areas, I do have to mention that transition is almost perfect. You have Pete Hegseth, right? He has the Jerusalem Cross, the Asphalt. He's the, say, hypothetically, the new Secretary of Defense of the United States. And you have the altar boy, Orthodox Andrei Removich Belousov, representing the Russian Federation. So you have 2 ministers of defense, essentially, both of them Christian in their own sort of way. Again, Andrei Belousov is very much a man who, his father was so deeply Soviet. His middle name, Removich, It comes from the name Rem. Rem is not a Christian name. It doesn't mean Rem fan for any of you hardcore sort of conspiracy fans. Rem stands for Revolution Engels Marx, REM. Essentially, it's a name invented by the Leninist Bolshevik government, which young children were named after. So Belousov, his middle name is literally a scar left from the Soviet Bolshevik regime. So just considering that. But a mixed bag here. Interestingly, Belousov traveled to, I think it was Rostov-on-Don, the Southern Command Center. He met up with some key Russian generals who were actually stationed in Zaporozhye for a while now. As we know, Zaporozhye, the battles there have quieted down since the counter-military operation by Ukraine in July of 2023 and that entire failed sort of counterattack by Ukraine. But what's interestingly is this took place on the 11th of November, so roughly 5 to 6 days ago. And Belousov's inspection of the Zaporozhye forces, he received all the briefs, all the sort of documentation. And after the 11th of November, suddenly the Russian forces on literally every single front except Kherson began moving and pushing forward very hard. So it's been almost a week and Russia has been gaining ground significantly. Now, mind you, there hasn't been a new mobilization. There haven't been, tens and hundreds of kilometers taken from Ukraine. But overall, the gains are significant and they are applying immense pressure on Ukraine. Ukraine is the regime of Zelensky is being pushed in from literally all angles, beginning from in Zaporozhye, just south of the actual city of Zaporozhye itself, in the town of Orekhov. The Russians are pushing through Orekhov at the moment. There is actual confrontations. The Russians who have been in defensive positions for almost a year now have suddenly begun literally going into Orekhov, fighting Ukrainians there, bombarding them with long-range artillery. Orekhov has a direct road to the city of Zaporozhye itself, which constitutionally is a city which the Russian Federation should hypothetically take. This is probably on the to-do list for Vladimir Putin himself. Next, moving eastwards along the Zaporozhye border, we have Gulyai Polya, which is essentially a long steppe land. And Gulyai Polya, that particular city-town, is also under deep siege by Russia. Russia has moved into the Gulyai Polya. Velikaya Novoselovka, which is closer to the Donetsk-Zaporozhye border, also being sieged by Russia. And moving into Donetsk Oblast, Russians are also pushing into Kurakhova, which I'm sure most of you have heard already at this point. Kurakhova is, of course, close to Pokrovsk, that very major big city. And the Russians are moving into the outskirts of Pokrovsk, very deep, several kilometers at this point. All the villages are being taken. Essentially, the Russians are pushing in a sort of linear fashion along the entire Zaporozhye-Donetsk border, moving north, of course, heavily fighting in Toretsk, Chasov Yar. Russians have captured most of Chasov Yar and Toretsk at the moment. But again, it's almost like an Avdiivka-Bakhmut situation where both Toretsk and Chasov Yar are experiencing very heavy suburban civil fighting at the moment. Ukraine is not, in a very stubborn fashion, it's not leaving these particular cities and towns, despite the fact that they're not as heavily defended as like a Bakhmut or an Avdiivka, as Avdiivka was essentially this stronghold fortress city, as Andrei Afanasyev described. Avdiivka was also prepared as a sort of Helm's Deep-like Ukrainian stronghold in the Donetsk Oblast to sort of defend against Russia, which Russia has taken a huge achievement. And Chasov Yar, Toretsk are more or less just these suburban cities which Russia has now entered into, but Ukrainians are not looking to leave. Moving further north, this is probably the biggest development thus far, incredibly demoralizing for Ukraine, given the fact that Donald Trump has come to the presidency. There are a lot of Ukraine skeptics in his future cabinet, potentially most of these ministerial appointees, these people such as even Marco Rubio, I would say, and Matt Gaetz. They're very strongly kind of, looking at Ukraine with a lot of suspicion. You have Kupiansk. Kupiansk is located, Conrad, on the border of Lugansk and Kharkovsk Oblast. So this is not even Donetsk anymore. It's literally Kharkovsk Oblast, and it's not Volchansk either. It's essentially located between Slavyansk, that famous city that Strelkov held off in 2014 during the beginning of the Third World War, you can almost say, and Kharkov. It's a very key city. It's surprising that Kupiansk is even being taken by Russians. It's the only city from which we have actual footage of Russian tanks and Russian armed vehicles and infantrymen literally going into the city from, this is footage from the outside, almost no opposition from Ukraine. Ukraine did not expect this incursion into Kupiansk. Kupiansk is a very key city. There's a direct road, essentially a highway or a freeway leading from Kupiansk to the city of Kharkov, further in the northwest. So this is a giant development. It's surprising that Ukraine has not exactly announced any of these losses officially, and all of these pushes into these various territories are taking place literally at the moment as we speak. So in fact, the footage is not really being produced en masse. The fighting is ongoing on all these fronts. And moving further north, of course, in Kharkov, Volchansk, Kharkovskaya Oblast is being bombarded by Russia. Again, Ukraine retaliates by sending these long-range drones behind Russian front lines to sort of try to demoralize the military positioned in the flanks, especially the general staff located there. But it's not really slowing the Russians down at all. Next, they've captured essentially a large pocket of Ukrainians near the town of Sudzha. Essentially, it's just east of Sudzha. So those Ukrainians who have, Sudzha is a very key town, but the Ukraine tried to push further east into Russian-held Kurskaya Oblast territory, and they've been caught into a cauldron. The cauldron is almost closed, and in fact, if it does close, thousands of Ukrainians will be counted as a loss for the army of Ukraine. Essentially, captured prisoners, most of them probably wounded, or even, I would say, probably hundreds will be killed if they refuse to surrender. It'll be a dramatic loss. So the Kurskaya Oblast, villages are being taken. Kurskaya Oblast is essentially being retaken by Russia. And Russians are, interestingly enough, Conrad, they are making all these developments in the wake of Belousov's visit to the Zaporozhye staff in Rostov-on-Don, his sort of discussion with all these personnel, and in the wake of Trump's re-election. So it's almost as if the Russians can read the writing on the wall, and they understand that Trump will be pressuring the Russian Federation and will be pressuring the government in Kiev, the terrorist and anti-Christian government of Zelensky, into a certain peace talk. And so prior to any sort of peace treaties being organized or any sort of Minsk-free agreements, which again, I'm personally opposed to, and I think Conrad is too, nevertheless, Russia wishes to retake as much territory as it can prior to any sort of official maps are drawn of what the future of Ukraine will look like here. So in fact, this particular push on every single front is somewhat unprecedented. It's perhaps the first real offensive that Russia has taken in 2024. And the really crazy news, again, is that the North Korean forces are basically confirmed to be in the Kurskaya Oblast. There's almost 10,000 of them, including, according to Western media sources, we have new information, there are 3 North Korean generals as well in order to lead these 10,000. The other interesting detail, again, is the fact that the Russians are preparing an additional 40,000 troops, which are currently not fighting in Kursk, in order to push back and retake the entire Kurskaya Oblast in the near future. This can take place this week, the following week, very, very soon. But there's a large strike force, and the Western sort of spy media, essentially, as we know, the West is very effective at spying on essentially these Russian force formations. They're looking at beyond the Kurskaya Oblast itself in areas which are not being targeted by Ukraine at the moment. The Russians are developing a very, very powerful organized strike force in order to take back the areas occupied by Ukraine. So Kurskaya Oblast may not be under Ukrainian control for much longer, at least this particular area of it. So really well-developed locations there. And of course, the 11 front line, which has just opened up, and perhaps this is the first time since the war, since the beginning of the SMO, Russians have crossed into the Chernigovskaya Oblast, located literally on the Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian borders, kind of where it all intersects. The Russians have crossed into Chernigov and have planted a few flags with the Russian Federation. So very interestingly, no cities were taken, but certain key road highway points were taken and Russians have planted their flags. Ukraine is claiming that this isn't an offensive, it's just Russians have breached border security and haven't really invaded, or this isn't really a Russian counteroffensive taking place in Chernigov. But it does show that not all Ukrainian borders are strongly protected, which sort of points towards, some people have said, well, maybe Russia's planning an incursion into the Chernigovskaya Oblast with the help of Belarusians, perhaps. Maybe they're trying to mirror what Ukraine and Zelensky and Syrskyi organized in Kursk, potentially. And all of this is taking place in the wake of these so-called peace talks. So again, huge developments, very, very positive. And in light of all of this, Ukraine is retaliating by sending very deep drones into Russian territories. You've probably heard about the Moskovskaya Oblast, essentially the Russian Air Force shooting down drones, Russian air defense shooting down drones flying all the way deep into the heart of Moscow. There were 5 drones shot down over the Tverskaya, Bryanskaya Oblast, 3 over the Penzinskaya region, and 2 more over the Voronezh region. These are deep sort of Russian regions far away from Belgorod, Bryansk. It's surprising that Ukrainians are flying drones this far into essentially the heartland of Russia. It's quite scary for civilians, because you never know. You see a drone in the sky, it could be just a civilian drone, children playing around with it, or it could literally be a Ukrainian suicide drone targeting particular civilian or military structures. So quite crazy. And in a way, it kind of mimics the fact that both Israel is using drones in Gaza at the same time very actively. Ukraine is using drones to demoralize civilians. And even Hezbollah has begun using drones in order to hit Israeli military targets over Tel Aviv and Haifa, in particular, very long-range drones, which they kind of appear out of nowhere and they surprise everyone, like the one that hit Netanyahu's holiday house in Caesarea. So it's it's a shock and awe sort of effect that these drones have on civilian populations, kind of in the flank of an ongoing battle. So very interesting. But these developments across the borders of Ukraine and Russia, it's still developing. The stories are still coming out at the moment. But Kupiansk, I think the taking of Kupiansk is probably the biggest achievement we've heard about so far since the retaking of the majority of Kursk. And Russians have really shown themselves to threaten, I think, what Ukraine has taken. And the most surprising thing is it appears that Ukrainian morale has gone down to such an extent, Conrad, that they're not really defending. There's no real Ukrainian counteroffensives taking place in any of these locations. Ukrainians are just slowly and steadily losing land, losing some of these villages and key defense positions. So I think generally speaking, in light of all of the church persecution taking place, the pressure against Orthodox Christians, and even I would say geopolitically, the pressure against any sort of pro-Russian, pro-BRICS, anti-Western countries, I think generally speaking, this major counteroffensive led by Belousov, this may be his magnum opus sort of move. I think it's very positive development, which we're seeing at the moment in the SMO zones. So very kind of excited to see that Russia at the same time is no longer on the deep defensive position that it's been in. Of course, disregarding the taking of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, but still Russia has been holding back for a long time. And now suddenly it is on the move again, taking back territory, which at one point had belonged to it historically. And I think geopolitically, Ukraine really shouldn't have control over any of these territories in which it's essentially persecuted Christians and even Russian-speaking people for more than 10 years now. So I would say very positive developments on the front lines for the Russian Federation.
Now, the news about Chernigov is very white-pilling that, Russia isn't just totally abandoning the idea of entering and taking the territory in some of these other oblasts. But a big piece of news that a lot of people are talking about, of course, is that for the first time in 2 years, Putin had a phone call with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which is funny because Olaf Scholz is part of a party that has single-digit support in Germany, which I think is just very funny. But this is from antiwar.com. Russian President Vladimir Putin held a phone call with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and offered to end the war in Ukraine. The Russian leader offered a deal similar to one proposed by Moscow in June. On Friday, Scholz spoke with Putin for the first time in nearly 2 years. According to the Kremlin, the Russian president noted that the Russian side has never refused and remains open to the resumption of the negotiations that were interrupted by the Kiev regime, adding Russia's proposals are well known and outlined in particular in a June speech at the Russian Foreign Ministry. In that speech, Putin said that if Ukrainian forces withdrew from all Russian annexed territory, adopted a position of neutrality between NATO and Russia, agreed to denazification and demilitarization of the country, and the lifting of all Western sanctions on Moscow, then Russia would bring the war to an end. Scholz's spokesman said that the German and Russian leaders agreed to remain in contact. The official added that Scholz condemned the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and called on President Putin to end it and withdraw his troops. He also told Putin Berlin maintains steadfast determination to support Ukraine for as long as necessary. So I want to know your thoughts, Dimitri, on that phone call, as well as the ongoing rumors about the North Korean troops that are, according to the New York Times, they claim 40 to 50,000 of them are just currently present in Kursk. I want to know your thoughts on those rumors, and then we can get into a conversation about what exactly we think this map is going to look like as Donald Trump attempts to end this war.
Well, yeah, I think we're going to see a huge territorial exchange, Conrad, like we mentioned last week. In Energodar, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, Ukraine is going to look to organize any sort of exchange for that territory. I think they're even willing to give up possibly in the entire Donetsk Oblast in order to obtain the position of Energodar and those, thermal power plant stations in order to fuel some of its key cities like Kryvyi Rog, Zaporozhye, Dnipro, etc. These cities depend on essentially a nuclear power which is coming from a nuclear power plant currently occupied by Russia. So at this point, Ukraine, I think, will be willing to essentially trade up some of this key territory. But we spoke about that last week. In particular, I think what we're seeing is the Khersonskoye Oblast. There's not much movement going on there. Zaporozhye, I think the fact that the Zaporozhye move is really unexpected. Ukraine has failed there in the past. I think the troops that Ukraine have stationed in Zaporozhye are so demoralized by the failure of 2023 that they're probably going to be giving up a lot of territory through Novoselovka. Orekhov's going to be taken shortly. Again, Gulay Pole, really, there's nothing more to take. It's just steppe lands. There's no mountains. There's no sort of hills. It's really clear territory. So as soon as taking into account, if Ukraine does not really mind up that entire area, Russia will be able to take large swaths of just essentially farmland and forest territory, villages. It'll kind of be unimpeded, and as it pushes further westwards. But the real question will be the city of Zaporozhye itself. Will that go towards Russia? I'm very skeptical that Ukraine will be willing to give that city up. Constitutionally, it should be a Russian city, but at the same time, I think this Minsk Free Agreement, it will require certain concessions from the United Russia Party, including Vladimir Putin himself. And I think Putin's recent very pro-Trump comments at the Valdai Summit, his 4-hour speech, I think it has shown that he's actually willing to sacrifice possibly some of Russia's interests in order to score some points for himself as sort of as a politician who has essentially met some of the objectives of the SMO, but also has become this peacekeeping person in the entire conflict, which I think is a bit contradictory. I think Russian interests should come first in this region. Ukraine has betrayed essentially not just its own people, its own Christian population, but the interests, I think, of peace in all of Eastern Europe. So I don't think any sort of Minsk Free should be signed. But looking at the borders, Conrad, the key, I think, is for the Donetsk Oblast and the Donetsk People's Republic, which has suffered the most out of all of these areas and out of all these territories of the SMO zone. I think that Donetsk will be primarily, all of Donetsk will be given over to Russia. I think that's one of the key agreements. In Kharkovskoy Oblast, I think Russians will be probably told by the Trump administration to pull back into Bryansk, into Belgorod, leave Kharkov to the Ukrainians. Kupiansk, its occupation at the moment may be temporary if a Minsk-free sort of agreement will be signed. It couldn't even be a Minsk-free. It could be an Ankara 1, right? Looking at how the Turkish sort of politicians and Erdogan in particular have been playing up to essentially both sides and sort of organizing the peace talks over the last 2.5 years. So very interesting developments. But again, Kursk will be the major trading point here. I think it's the thing that both sides want very much. And Kursk Oblast, those particular territories, I think will be it's essentially the ace up Ukraine's sleeve at the moment. The fact that Ukraine is still holding on to it, I think, is very important for both Zelensky, Syrskyi, and the future of the entire, I think, Ukrainian political elite. If they can hold on to Kursk all the way up until the negotiations, they'll be able to trade it for some of those key territories that Russia currently occupies. So that's why they're holding on to it, just like terrorists would hold on to hostages during hostage negotiations and some of those terror strikes and operations. So very, very interesting developments. And again, I'm not too hopeful. I think there is a certain element of the Russian political elite which are actually vowing for peace, which do want a temporary sort of pause on the action taking place on the front lines, Conrad, and they probably will be interested in giving up even some of Russia's interests. I don't think Andrei Belousov, given his recent appointment, given the cleanses and the audits going on in the Ministry of Defense, I don't think he's that sort of guy. I don't think he would betray Russian interests, but there are others. I know that we've discussed some of them quite in depth as to exactly who these people are. Most of them are working in the Russian central bank, trying to balance out Russian inflation, interest rates. A lot of the personnel working in the Russian economics departments in the banking financial industry, those involved in sort of lightening the blow of the American 20, 30,000 sanctions by the EU, by the United States, those are the real traders, I think, who will essentially surrender anything in order to have Russia loosen some of that sanction pressure on itself. And I think those are the people who Vladimir Putin should be looking out for as the potential, fifth column involved in any future negotiations. And I don't think he should be listening to any of those people, any of those sort of suits working in the banking or financial industry in Russia, because those are the people who are most disconnected from the general population, from the men and women and the children in the SMO zones, and of course the Russian military, which has since become one of the most powerful forces, I think, in the world and has probably the largest number of veterans, probably equivalent to the United States of America in terms of people who have went through combat and who have a very interesting future ahead of them in terms of their role in the future of the Russian political regime. There's veterans entering back into the Russian. You can look at the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense in the United States, Pete Hegseth, those sort of guys. Russia will have an entire slew of post-SMO, post-Ukraine war veterans entering into politics in the near future. And I think their opposition to these pro-finance, pro-Western integration capitalist economists, I think this will be the most interesting domestic conflict in the future of the Russian Federation.
I think you made a lot of good points there as far as the future map from my predictions. I really hope that as far as these regions that Russia has partially entered when it comes to Kherson and Zaporozhye, obviously those have to be fully taken. And I believe Chernigov, Sumy, a lot of these places, everything, of course, east of the Dnieper, as well as, I believe, Odessa, Nikolaev, these need to be part of the deal. Anything short of that, I believe, is a Pyrrhic victory at best. And I think, of course, we hear people like Medvedev and, other nationalists that people like to follow will talk about this stuff. But Putin himself, Lavrov, they have never really talked about any kind of realized gains in a legal sense outside of the 4 oblasts that have been constitutionally incorporated. But again, obviously, Kursk has to be retaken. And despite Trump's, claims that he's going to settle this, I agree with you, Dmitry, that right now, Russia needs more mobilization and less, talk about freezes right now, and they need to be going into future negotiations more on their own terms. But before we leave the European situation, talk about Africa, I want to talk about, we mentioned Olaf Scholz. We have to talk about the brief situation in Germany. A group of 113 German lawmakers from various factions have signed an application to initiate proceedings to ban the far-right Alternative for Germany party. This is widely reported in German news. Marco Wanderwitz, a conservative lawmaker, conservative, of course, from the center-right CDU, said their application has been submitted to the German parliament's President Barbel Baas. He emphasized the urgency of the matter, citing the upcoming new election as a critical factor in the timing of this action. The primary objective is to submit and vote on the application during the current legislative period, potentially enabling the Federal Constitutional Court to commence proceedings, according to the lawmaker. For those that don't know, the FCC, that is not the, it's not the same as the FCC here in the States. This is the FCC in Germany, which basically, entirely exists to stop you from getting too based and from saying anything nice about Hitler or from saying anything bad about Jewish people. And if you do those things, these guys come after you and you're not allowed to do politics or basically exist as a human being. And of course, we know that February elections are coming up in Germany, and everybody's very afraid because the AfD is polling second across the nation behind the CDU, who are the center-right party. And of course, you'd think in a reasonable society, they would form a right-wing coalition. But, everybody's against, you say anything about deporting immigrants or, you don't like Israel enough in Germany and you get branded with the swastika, and that is just not acceptable. But I'm going to go on to keep reading this article. It says, in the past, several attempts to ban far-right parties have failed due to legal controversies, lack of objective evidence, or mistakes made in case preparation. The FCC turned down an application to ban the far-right NPD party in 2003 on the grounds that some of the party officials used as witnesses were informants of the Domestic Intelligence Agency. A second attempt to outlaw the NPD also failed in 2017, as the federal judges concluded that the party did not have the potential to realize its anti-constitutional or anti-democratic activities. So, of course, they didn't want to ban the party because it was all feds. And then because it was all feds, it wasn't relevant in 2017. And of course, according to this article, they're claiming that the AfD is polling at 17%, while Olaf Scholz is polling at 16%. I believe nationwide in Germany, the AfD is higher than that, and Scholz is polling lower than that. They put the CDU at 33%. I think more of that percentage at this point is going to the AfD. At this point, almost every region outside of a few cities, the entire part of Eastern Germany that used to be under the Soviet Union votes for the AfD, and the entire Western Germany that, of course, was under the previous state of Western Germany before the reunion after the fall of the Soviet Union, they all vote for the CDU. So it's basically just center-right cuckoldry versus, post-Soviet, nationalism. And that's how we're going to see it play out in this upcoming election. Of course, you've got Scholz's Social Democrats and the Greens are trailing well behind. I think both of them in reality are polling below 10%, but this gives them slightly more generous numbers. But again, it's an attempt. I believe the headline is very funny. It's 113 lawmakers sign application for party ban, citing concerns over far-right AfD's anti-democratic behavior, anti-constitutional goals. So it's, they're trying to preserve democracy by just banning more parties, which is, classic behavior. But unless you have any comments on that, Dimitri, I want to briefly bring up the situations in Jubaland and Somaliland doing similar things. These are, Somalia's, a failed state. Mogadishu is not able to exercise control over any of these provinces, and Jubaland is the far southern province of Somalia, borders Ethiopia and Kenya, and they have allowed the Ethiopians to enter parts of their region and occupy airstrips that would ostensibly prevent Somalia proper from waging any kind of war against them if Ethiopia is to move forward with its bases that Somaliland, the other breakaway region in the north of Somalia, is offering them. And Jubaland, I believe this severing of diplomatic relations and recognition of Mogadishu has to do with disputes over how local and national elections are supposed to be held. I don't know if it's meant to be permanent, but with that combined with the Ethiopia issue, it seems that Somalia as we know it, if it weren't for this bizarre insistence on the Muslim world for holding together this union, and then, of course, support from the United States, Somalia would have stopped existing a long time ago. And of course, this ties in with the Ethiopia issue, which is really more of a proxy war versus Egypt at this point, because we know they have their issue with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in the Nile, and Egypt is the main African Arab state that is pledging troops to Somalia. Turkey as well actually is supporting them, but Egypt more so. So again, this failed state being a bit of a proxy war for these two, this ostensibly Christian and this Muslim superpower, to go against each other. And it all has to do with access to the sea, which Russia is very sympathetic towards Ethiopia for. So very interesting development there. It could be viewed as, in some capacity, at least if Russia maintains its support for Ethiopia, as another mild Turkish versus Russian proxy, like many of the other states, Syria, Libya, and the other places that we like to talk about.
Most certainly. And I think the other clear connection here is that Russia does have certain interests in Sudan, and it looks like Ethiopia is working very hard not to break that Sudanese, given that Sudan literally has a civil war taking place within its borders. Ethiopia is not looking to agitate Sudan whatsoever. There was a Sudanese politician who's recently made some very anti-Ethiopian statements, and instantly the Ethiopian government have called him into the capital of Addis Ababa very soon. So, of course, the foreign minister of Ethiopia stated that the main ambassador of Sudan needs to arrive to the Ethiopian capital in order to explain himself. And he did. This took place literally 2 days ago. And Ethiopia is looking for close relationships regarding the Nile Dam, everything taking place there regarding water. And again, we know fresh water, at least for Egypt, for its agricultural future is so important. And Sudan really can't get involved as sort of, at least from the Ethiopian perspective, as this sort of one additional pro-Islamic country in this coalition against the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians, in fact, despite the fact that we've kind of described them as the weak link here, as the solitary country that's being pressured from all sides, most of the countries surrounding Ethiopia are actually not that strong in a military or economic sense, but the fact that they outnumber the Ethiopians, essentially that gives them the edge, I think. And so this is why it shouldn't surprise you that Ethiopia is seeking alliances with both Israel, with Russia, with some of its not necessarily neighbors, but some of these countries which are far away, which are ostensibly anti-Islamic in their sort of views and some of their positions. And again, Russia's kind of Muslim skeptic at this point, I would say. Even if, as we mentioned earlier, in regards to the axis of resistance, there's still a question as to exactly where Russia lies on this particular axis, and even if it is a member of that axis. But generally speaking, those developments in Ethiopia and Somalia, I think, are very, very interesting because conflict there will really break out, I think, in the next few months at the very least, especially given the recent elections in Somaliland and some of the pressures on Somalia. Now, most of you need to just appreciate the other fact that Somalia, generally speaking, since the 1990s, has been very heavily under the influence of both Turkey and Egypt. It's almost like a broken state which has lost its sovereignty. In a way, it's if Ukraine today was to have a long-standing peace with Russia, you would know for sure that Ukraine in the future would not be an independent sovereign state. It would be under essentially the influence of NATO and the EU for literally decades to come. And this is the same situation with Somalia. And so the Egyptian animosity with Ethiopia is completely understandable. Egypt views Somalia as essentially its client state, as a sort of proxy in a way on the Horn of Africa, which it needs to protect from Ethiopian aggression and Ethiopian geopolitical interests. But we view Ethiopia with somewhat favorably, given the fact that they are essentially surrounded and they've been pressured by essentially the international community for literally decades at this point. And you can say almost centuries. It's one of the only African countries which really hasn't been colonized by Central and Western European colonialists during the 1700s and 1800s. And its future very much may define the future of Christianity in all of Africa, generally speaking, if the country can actually gain access to the Red Sea and to the Indian Ocean and probably expand its interests going forward. It's one of the sort of potentially the hypothetical gems of Africa, despite the fact that the majority of the country, again, Conrad, is deeply underdeveloped. There's a lot of famine and other social issues. Ethiopia has a very bright future if it can overcome these current geopolitical struggles. And the same can be said, again, about the Sahel, which paints very interesting sort of dynamics. Almost like both sides of Africa have their sort of issues. The Sahel Belt, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, again, aligning with Russia. You have countries like Equatorial Guinea, which has recently invited 200 especially Russian military experts to arrive in Equatorial Guinea, a small country, but again, on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. It's almost like the port of Tartus in Syria, the port of Latakia, which Russia has been using in the Mediterranean as its sort of base in order to gain a foothold on the Mediterranean Sea. In the same way, Equatorial Guinea can be viewed, it's such a small, minor country. It might be one of the smallest countries in Africa in general, one of the poorest countries, least developed, generally speaking, in terms of IQ. We mentioned earlier, like on average, people are deeply uneducated there, but nevertheless, Russians are looking to at least expand their foreign policy very aggressively now that essentially the entire Western world has declared an economic war against them. So really, there's nothing really stopping Russian interest into expanding into countries of Africa, which are inviting Russians to them. So you have 200 military Russian experts, similar to NATO experts, who are certainly stationed in Kiev and other Ukrainian oblasts right now, fighting against Russia, providing intelligence, training to Ukrainians. Russians are stationed in Equatorial Guinea, which again is not on the Sahel belt, but it's very close, and it does have access to that Atlantic Ocean. So maybe Russia has literally gained a port in the Western hemisphere of the world, essentially from Africa. So who knows? I mean, this is maybe civilizational level development going forward. But again, this is just one of the first steps. We know Equatorial Guinea is very interested in sort of exploiting some of its gas and oil reserves, which are located in the sea there off the coast of Africa. So maybe perhaps Russian companies can be assisting it in doing so. So Russian interests are being expanded, and generally speaking, Africa will be one of those fronts, which again will probably not have the most intense fighting, but as we've seen in some of the events in the 20th century, right? Africa, despite the absence of military technology, may have some of the most severe death counts in terms of future massacres, famines, things of this nature, as soon as world affairs are disrupted in a severe way. So again, most of these African countries are literally choosing sides as we speak. They're choosing alliances, choosing as to whom they will cooperate with before the great breakdown of world affairs and before the sort of great stalemate is finally decided.
No, Africa is a very important front. I think it's very relevant in the BRICS episode with Gennady. Everyone should go listen to that Easter hour that recently dropped. All of the continents that, people call the third world, the global south, are becoming these big energy grabs, these land, territory, UN vote grabs, all sorts of things that come with control of a country. And of course, this is from Reuters. It says Russian power creeps across West Africa with Equatorial Guinea mission as Russia deploys 200 military instructors to the country to protect the presidency. We have heard of disruptions in Equatorial Guinea in the past, and many countries around Equatorial Guinea. Obviously, we have the Sahel countries, and Equatorial Guinea getting a little bit south, almost closer to countries like Central African Republic, which that's really like Wagner home base, where they really, kind of got their African chops and first, fought in the heart of dark Africa. And of course, I don't know that much about Equatorial Guinea. I know that if you look at it on a map, there's the little land square and then the island, but most of them live on the little island off the coast. I also know that at one point there was an IQ map that had the average IQ there at 59, which, as Dimitri mentioned off camera, I believe is lower than even certain simian characters that roam the earth. So obviously, I think there might have been a rounding error or something. But either way, they need some education and they need some infrastructure development. And if Wagner can protect their president, I think all the better, and power to those, Equatorial Guineans. But obviously, the Sahel is also seeing, shifts and turns as the Russian mission there continues to fight against all these different terrorist groups that are still roaming the desert around there. Chad is getting accused of helping the rapid support forces in the situation, the war in Sudan, and of course, the fact that French weapons are ending up in Sudan is also, people are trying to get the French on sanctions violations and all these sorts of things. But unless you have anything else to say about Africa, Dimitri, we do need to move on to some of these church persecutions, some situations going on in Ukraine, as well as some Esfigmen new updates and some other issues. Unless you want to talk about Abkhazia first, because those are probably where we're going to end if we don't have anything to say about the Pacific.
Yeah, that's right. There were some political protests in Abkhazia, and specifically against the Abkhazian government officials who are currently being charged with corruption, or at least allegedly they were investigated. Most of these protesters appear as if they are liberal, democratic, Western-backed, essentially libtards protesting against the sovereign government of Abkhazia. But we do have to keep in mind, Abkhazia, generally speaking, it's always been run by local hierarchical elites in general. Like most people who know Georgian politics, the politics of the Caucasus, these are deeply hierarchical nations, ethnic groups, kind of old school and traditional, you can say, in a good way, except for the fact that as soon as you inject liberalism and capitalism into some of these traditionalist hierarchical countries, you have a very deep mammon corruption that takes place. So a lot of these corrupt oligarchs running Abkhazia at the moment, the average people are against it, and so you have these protests happening on the streets. The average Abkhazia, though, they don't see themselves as Georgians. So in fact, this isn't like a pro-Georgian integration protest or any sort. It's literally Abkhazians upset with their own government bureaucrats, which I think there may be some grounds for that, looking sort of deeper, but the protest is still ongoing. It's not like people are being lynched off the streets or there's been any sort of killings. And in fact, we've seen the protests in Georgia actually were a lot more intense and took a lot more attention away from any other world affairs, because we know Georgia is one of the targets for the world government in order to use them against Orthodox interests in the Caucasus, essentially, and probably against the Russian Federation in the future. I think Georgia is still one of those countries that the West is trying to use as a battering ram kind of going forward. But I did mention to you, Conrad, earlier that Abkhazia, anytime liberal, democratic, anti-corrupt protests are taking place in any country, we do have to look at who's behind the protests, specifically who's organizing them, who's leading them, because most of the time, these people, and knowing, Navalny, FBK, for example, some of these organizations that worked in Russia at the time, essentially exposing corruption in the Russian Federation, most of them were backed by Western interests, and most of them were very deeply liberal and anti-traditional. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like exposing corruption may be a good thing, but the people taking advantage of it are generally evil and generally belong to clans which are subservient to the globalists in the West and other places around the world. So yeah, that's something we just have to keep in mind. But moving into another country which is deeply globalist controlled, right? Unfortunately, Ukraine has seen further very interesting, smaller stories this week in terms of persecution, interesting developments. We had Father John Polishuk, one of the priests this week. He was, again, stolen from his home parish. His bishop hasn't spoken out in his defense, and he's been literally taken to a Ukrainian military base and sent for basic training. He's going to be trained for a few months and then sent to the front lines, most likely to Kursk or into one of the 11 different places which I mentioned earlier in where the really deep fighting is taking place. So Ukrainians are literally using priests as cannon fodder, untrained priests, deacons, people who they're stealing from their home parishes, from their families, and sending them to fight against essentially their own blood and their own kin in terms of spiritual life, their own Orthodox brothers on the Russian side. Very evil deed. Really, again, this really paints as to who exactly is correct in this SMO conflict taking place in Eastern Europe. But on the other hand, we do have bizarre stories such as Archpriest Vyacheslav Yakovenko. He was a very well-known archpriest in his particular diocese. In 2014, his church was actually one of the churches which suffered during the Banderite raids on churches. His church wasn't exactly occupied, but there were essentially pro-Ukrainians who were accusing him of being a pro-Russian priest. This was in 2014. 10 years later, today, Archpriest Vyacheslav has put on a Kevlar, has equipped himself with all the medical equipment, grenades, taken up an AK-47 with attachments, and essentially asked to be crowdfunded in order to be sent to the front line. So he's currently actually heading off to fight against the Russians. So Archpriest Vyacheslav himself has technically defrocked himself officially, left his diocese, left his parish in order to, according to him, defend his homeland against the Russian aggressors and the Russian invaders. So you can see the brainwashing kind of works essentially both ways, both the laity and even the pastors and the shepherds of the Orthodox Church. And he was a canonical priest from the UOC, from the church being led by Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev. A very dire example of what happens when the media literally tortures your mind into essentially turning against common sense and even against some of the spiritual teachings of the elders of Ukraine, who have always spoken out against this particular terroristic state and what was taking place during the Maidan, and who have essentially prophesied that Ukraine itself will turn against God in the future. And yet Archpriest Vyacheslav is now getting into a car and driving to defend his homeland against Russians to kill essentially his own kin who are coming to liberate his church from persecution. A very demonic example of a story. But moving on, we do have Ukraine announcing officially on the 23rd, 24th of November, and this is another light form of persecution, Conrad. There's going to be a queer fest in Kiev in a week's time. Again, the fact that this is taking place during a war, we know in the past we had Ukrainian Cossacks, right-wing Ukrainians from various churches, even Roman Catholic unions, literally beating up these pro-LGBTQ alphabet community people who were parading around different Ukrainian cities, including Lvov as well. So even far out west, the gay parades were not allowed in Kiev prior to 2014. And now, after 2022, I guess this is one of the negative fruits of the SMO. Most of the right-wing Orthodox Christians are either dead, in prison, or essentially have left Ukraine. And so these gay parades have complete liberty to sort of go on and be essentially unhindered, and they sort of operate with impunity. And so corrupting the youth, corrupting the general population of Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, one of the homes of the Theotokos, according to Orthodox tradition. Again, just another sign of how fallen exactly this Zelensky regime is and exactly what kind of values it's promoting amidst a literal war for its own existence. This is very curious and very telling. The other, I think, huge story is that, and this is the positive story, the Donetsk drama between Metropolitan Hilarion, who has left to go to Crimea for retirement. Prior to leaving, he actually got up on the Amvon in one of the Donetsk cathedrals, along with Metropolitan Vladimir, the future Donetsk Metropolitan all the way from Vladivostok, and he gave a speech where he essentially dispersed any rumors about corruption, the fact that he was forcefully removed from his diocese by the evil Patriarch Kirill and the Moscow Synod, the fact that the Russian military pressured him to retire. In fact, he said that this was an agreed sort of move, and he's happy to leave his diocese. He finds it sad, but he will enjoy his retirement in Crimea, and he's happy to bless Metropolitan Vladimir to take over the very important diocese of Donetsk going forward in the future. And so Metropolitan Hilarion gave that speech, and this sort of, I guess this particular speech, Conrad, it simply destroyed any of the rumors which were being produced in Kiev, even among some canonical Orthodox Ukrainian circles, that the Russian church was looking to essentially not just take Ukrainian territory, but also take some of the diocese parishes away from the Ukrainian church members and administration. And so it certainly caused the large ecclesiological drama, which at this point has died down because Metropolitan Hilarion very bravely spoke out in the open, and he's definitely showing that he wasn't coerced into any of the drama that's currently taking place. So it's quite a positive move, I think, development-wise. But the other most, I think, quite dire story was that, if you recall, the Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy, which was captured by Ukrainians several weeks ago, Ukraine has officially, on their television channels, these are fairly pro-right-wing Ukrainian channels, they've produced an entire documentary about all the Russian investments being held at the cathedral. They're showing the different mitres, the different staffs belonging to the Bishop of Cherkasy, the different items being held within the church, the relics, almost as if an expose, similar to the black and white exposés of church goods and relics and holy items we saw the Bolsheviks produce. And some of those photographs, you can see some of those early disgusting photographs from the 1920s. Ukrainians are doing the same, where they're like, wow, look at these vestments. These belong to a pro-Russian bishop at some point. It's almost as if they're viewing it not as objects of worship, objects of veneration, which took place in Ukraine and belonged to the Orthodox Christians, but almost as items which belong to the enemies. And it's just quite disturbing, I think, seeing all those items and the anti-Mints being abused. And yeah, this is just one of the negative outcomes of the Zelensky regime entrenching itself in Ukraine, and one of the reasons why it needs to be removed, and why essentially a false peace doesn't resolve any of the issues we speak about here on the show.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for the overview. I think everyone loves hearing what's going on in Ukraine, even if unfortunately most of it is unfortunate to hear. But other church news I want to bring everybody, of course, the Isfigmenu Schismatic Brotherhood. They are bringing a case before the United Nations Human Rights Committee against the Greek state, who have been attempting to seize their property and restrict their access and restrict access to their other properties throughout Greece that the Isfigmenu Brotherhood is, supposedly still owns. They, of course, the EP wants to transfer it to the new Isfigmenu Brotherhood that Bartholomew created in 2005. And this is, a big escalation as far as the jurisdiction goes. Of course, the Greek government commuted a lot of the years off the sentences of Abbot Methodius and the other monk that threw Molotov cocktails at the police back in 2013. I think now that they're only going to have to serve like 2 years or something each if they ever actually, I don't even know if they've ever actually been brought into custody. But either way, they're bringing this before the UN Human Rights Committee. We're going to see how that goes. Obviously, we hope that this can somehow get resolved ecclesiastically and they can come back into communion. Mm-hmm. But as we said before, there are 5 different schismatic groups represented at the monastery. They just kind of all agree to cooperate so they can have this historic access to this old, historic Athonite monastery. There are relics there, all these other things. So it's an unfortunate situation, but we are also against what Patriarch Bartholomew did with the newest Isfigmenu Brotherhood. We believe that these monasteries need to be, these processes need to be worked out through the ecclesiastical process among the 20 Athonite monasteries, not having the EP come in and just erase one and bring in another. I think that's obviously a form of neo-papism that we see happening there. So pray for Mount Athos. Obviously, they recently just got rain after doing services asking for rain in the midst of drought. So we're happy to see that. But in some good news, the Serbian bishop, Kirillo, he visited his territories, or rather some of the Serbian churches going on in Guatemala. We know the EP is more present there, but thankfully in a good show of, Orthodox, pan-Orthodox unity on Sunday, November 10th, the feast of St. Arsenie of Srem, Archbishop of Serbia, Bishop Kirillo celebrated the Divine Liturgy with Bishop Osios of Guatemala, the newly consecrated first bishop of Mayan descent in the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The Divine Liturgy was served at the Holy Trinity Monastery on the shores of Lake Amatitlan. On this occasion, Abbess Ines was awarded the Diocesan Order of Saints Peter and Paul for her contribution to missionary work in Guatemala. The same order was awarded to Archimandrite Raphael in recognition of building the first Serbian Orthodox church and monastery in Ecuador. And we know that, I believe, Tristan Haggard even is involved in the Serbian Orthodox Church in Ecuador and in South America. So great to see things going on there. And we know that the Serbian church is still very close, of course, with the Russian church. So obviously, I believe that Bishop Osios himself, just because he's in the Ecumenical Patriarchate, doesn't mean that we should obviously lump him in with some of the other Phanariad bishops. I think he is clearly hoping to spread the pan-Orthodox faith in Guatemala. As we know, hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans have converted there. Some say it's the largest mass conversion to Christianity the largest mass conversion to Orthodox Christianity since the baptism of Rus, back in the 10th century. So beautiful things to hear. And we love obviously ending on a more positive note. But with all that being said, unless you have any final news, Dimitri, I'm going to do, the plugs and everything. I've been talking on the socials as well. I think I'm going to start doing a twice a week scheduled stream in the evenings. I'm thinking Tuesdays and Thursdays. This is, a few weeks out, still in the planning and setting up stage. But I think I'm going to do a twice a week stream, Tuesdays, Thursdays, maybe in the evenings. And I'm going to be, discussing the news, but maybe reacting to some content, reacting to some stuff, maybe getting involved in some e-drama, discussing some more cultural issues, shooting the stuff and gibbing and gabbing and all that kind of stuff so people can tune in, making some more content. Obviously, I want to eventually be able to go live on Substack, but I think before, until they allow for streaming software and, scheduling streams, it'll just be on the World War Now YouTube channel and the World War Now X account. But, be sure to tune into that. And in the comments of the Substack or YouTube, wherever you're listening, let me know what you would like to see talked about on those streams. Let me know if you're excited about that and if you would tune in and want to hear from you. But with all of that, be sure to follow us on X, World War Now _subscribe, obviously on Substack, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Get behind the paywall if you haven't already. Get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes. That includes our incredible interviews with Andrei Afanasyev, our discussions with Syrian Girl, all sorts of other episodes with Gregory Hears about St. John Batatzis. You get access to hours and hours and hours of paywalled content. So be sure to do that. It keeps the show going. Obviously, subscribe for free as well. If you can't do that, we appreciate all of the support. But like I said, on X, World War Now _, I am on X at GnomeRad. Dimitri is on X at OCanonist. Follow the Telegram channel at World War Now Telly. That is a great 24/7 news feed where we are always posting. Be sure to follow us on Rumble. We have a channel there, as well as, of course, subscribing to the YouTube channel, because we're going to be doing more and more live streams. And we have other archived live streams that you can watch there as well. So thank you so much for listening. Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of things taking place in world affairs. So stay tuned, keep following us on X, Telegram, very important to sort of catch the news live and catch our reactions sort of as they're happening. But we'll be continuing to analyze exactly what's taking place, giving you our essentially biased but yet uncensored opinions on world affairs, geopolitics, and the developments of the Third World War going forward into the future, as you can see. But definitely those of you Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics as well, those of you partaking in the Nativity fast prior to Christmas, enjoy that. I think it will be commencing shortly for those on the new calendar as well as the old calendar as well. So enjoy this sort of time, cleanse yourselves, pray, constrict yourselves, be ascetic as much as possible. We will too, of course, and best of luck. We will catch you on the next episode. Thank you for your support.
God bless everybody.